Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Zach Pakin and I'm the Deputy Director of the Better Order Project. As the world continues to move away from the unipolar structure born after the end of the Cold War, it also risks fracturing into competing and rival orders. The increasingly diffuse balance of power and the rising influence of the Global South together ensure that no state or group of states can set the terms of international order unilaterally. The Better Order Project contends that to ensure peace, stability, and a fighting chance against transnational threats, the world needs enhanced norms and laws to rejuvenate an inclusive global order rooted in international law, multilateralism, and the ability of states to participate on an equal basis. Our project forms part of the activities of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a transpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. that is working to build a world where peace is the norm and war the exception. And now, to the theme of today's webinar. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's recent speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos made headlines for its willingness to call out the growing appetites of all great powers, including the United States. But it was also noteworthy for its admission that Western countries have been selective in their enforcement of the so-called rules-based international order. Going forward, Mr. Carney promises that we will now see more variable geometry, meaning different coalitions on different sets of issues. But what does this mean for the future of multilateralism, multilateral reform, and international order more broadly? QI's Executive Vice President Trita Parsi and I offer our thoughts in an article published yesterday by our in-house magazine Responsible Statecraft, and you can find the link to that article in the webinar chat. But to unpack things even further, we are delighted and we are privileged to welcome today Ambassador David Lametti. Among other things, Dr. Lametti was previously a professor in the Faculty of Law at McGill University in Montreal, my alma mater as well, and then served as Canada's Minister of Justice and Attorney General from 2019 to 2023, and is currently Canada's Ambassador to the United Nations in New York City. Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, un plaisir de vous revoir. Bonjour et bienvenue.
Merci beaucoup. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être ici avec vous.
Merci bien, and we especially appreciate you taking the time to join us as our boys are taking on the Czechs in their opening game in Milan, where Mark Stone has just put Canada up 2-0 in the second period on a pass in front from Mitch Marner. Now, let's start with Prime Minister Carney's comments about the rules-based international order, if you don't mind. You'll recall that in 2017, less than a decade ago, Canada's then Foreign Affairs Minister, your former cabinet colleague, Chrystia Freeland, delivered an address to Parliament that made the defense of the rules-based international order into the guiding principle of Canadian foreign policy. But allow me now to quote from Prime Minister Carney's remarks delivered last month in Davos. He said, quote, "We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that trade rules were enforced asymmetrically. And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful," end quote. And he even drew a parallel on top of this between the West's rules-based international order discourse and the lies that once sustained communist regimes. So let me ask you, given all of that, over the past 9 years, what exactly changed?
Well, I think a recognition that there are certain powers in the world who are apparently increasingly inclined to not just not respect the rules-based order, but not use the language of the rules-based order. It's always been a fundamental, I won't say irony, it's actually been a fundamental presupposition of public international law or international law generally, that even when a nation state wasn't necessarily following or perhaps was running a risk of not following a particular norm, it would try to couch what it was doing within the language of the norm itself, right? We saw that most recently. With Venezuela, without making a comment about the American action in Venezuela. At the very least, it was couched in terms of defending the United States and defending the United States against a security threat. So that language in international law was always important. It remains important. The rules and norms that are there remain important. But what Prime Minister Carney, I think, was referring to was the obvious, which is increasingly large countries in particular were not necessarily even bothering to disguise that their actions within the framework of the language of the international order, and that's having an impact. That illustrates a change. He characterized it as a rupture, quite rightly, and we therefore need to look at we therefore need to continue to look at the international order, obviously, but we also need to look at other ways to operate in order to secure Canada's borders, in order to secure Canada's trade interests, in order to promote Canada's values, and that still remains important, in order to promote Canada's values. And the Prime Minister, I think, is pushing us towards thinking about variable kinds of alliances. I'm going to say temporary. Temporary can be very long term, but or very short term, as the case may be. But pushing us towards thinking about those kinds of temporary alliances and structures that would allow us to advance Canada's interests or secure Canada's interests. I think it's fair to say still within the larger structure of the rules-based order, the Prime Minister reiterated that the UN Charter was still important and represented our values. So there isn't a complete discarding of the current international rules-based order, but rather a recognition that there are certain gaps where we may need to act otherwise.
Got it. Let me pick up on the Venezuela issue, if you don't mind, that you brought up, which is, I mean, the United States did recently violate the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force, which Mr. Carney referred to in his speech as being an important norm, by attacking the sovereign country of Venezuela and kidnapping its de facto leader. And yet the response from most Western leaders was merely to pay lip service to the importance of international law without explicitly condemning the attack as a violation of international law. So now that we are somewhat more prepared to acknowledge the hypocrisies of the rules-based order narrative, is Canada going forward going to unambiguously call out and condemn all violations of international law, no matter where and no matter who the perpetrator may be?
But look, I think the Prime Minister has pushed us towards a pragmatic realism, and I think pragmatic realism would probably tell us that there's no set answer to the question you've just asked. It's going to depend on circumstances. Look, the values remain entrenched in a variety of different places and spaces. The UN Charter being the best example, and we are still going to promote those values. The Prime Minister has made that clear. We are still going to work to defend Canada's interests. We're still going to work with our allies. We're still going to work to quietly shape and publicly shape discussions as is appropriate as we move forward. So I don't know, I can't say for certain what the answer to your question will be, but moving forward, I think we have to be pragmatic and we have to keep our values in front of us, but understand that we're working in a different world where in one case we may use an institution such as the United Nations, and we may use the institutions of the world-based order, or in another situation, we may call upon other middle powers with like-minded values and principles to achieve some other end goal for the benefit of Canada and for the benefit of the world order.
Thanks so much for the very frank response. One last question on this. There is a narrative out there that Western countries are finally calling out Trump's violations of global norms with a little bit more force, because now we're the ones who are being targeted, right? Many seem to have no problem so long as the quote unquote right countries are the ones who are being bombed. And by that, I mean non-white countries in the global south. But once Trump set his sights on Greenland, Western leaders began singing a very different tune. Do you think that inconsistency there, poses a potential risk to the diplomatic and normative power of Western countries going forward?
Well, I would challenge the premise with respect to Canada. First of all, we have been vocal throughout, defending our own interests, defending our own border. We all saw the sort of 51st state rhetoric, which was rejected time and time again by not only our Prime Minister, but by Canadians. And frankly, no one has more to lose than Canada in any of these discussions. We have an economy that has been more or less, let's say, very well integrated with that of the United States for well over a century, if not longer, if you take into account pre-Canadian trade ties, pre-colonial trade ties even. I mean, the geography of North America runs north-south. Canada has an integrated economy. We have an integrated defense and security system. We share NORAD defense with the United States. It's interoperable. So nobody has more to lose than Canada by standing up to the United States.
I'm sorry, is it my signal that's been lost, or is it the ambassador's? It appears we have lost the ambassador for a moment. Hello, welcome back. You're just muted. I think we have to unmute you and we can resume.
Sorry about that. Where did you lose me?
No problem at all. You were just talking about how the economy of North America runs north-south, and Canada has a great deal to lose.
Yeah, and so does our defense. I'm not sure if the NORAD part got cut out, but we defend North America jointly with the United States. NORAD is one example. We're partners in NATO, and so no one has more to lose than Canada on the security front, on the economic front, in many ways on the personal front. A lot of personal ties between the two countries, and yet we have consistently made clear where we are willing to negotiate in good peace, and we've also drawn our lines, and we've stuck to them. So I can't speak for other countries in Europe, other countries, and I can't speak for Europe, but I certainly can speak for us in the sense that we have been firm and we have been clear, and we frankly have more to lose than anybody else, and yet we still have been anyway.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Let's move now to this theme of variable geometry, which is one of the key terms in the Prime Minister's address. In your understanding, is the primary focus of variable geometry merely building ad hoc coalitions on specific issues, or is it something more ambitious, like building a block of middle powers to defend international integration and international law against great power attempts to carve out spheres of influence, for example?
I think it's early days, Zach. To be honest, Davos was really in international terms only a short time ago, and I think it is possible that both of your hypotheses might be true, and that both might be true at the same time. I think there's room to see situations where it will be ad hoc, and perhaps even temporary. On the other hand, I think there's also room to say, depending on the ongoing practices and behavior of countries of big powers, that there might be room for more stable coalitions. Of what the Prime Minister has made clear is that we're prepared to lead, and we're prepared to lead according to our values. And I think it could take us in either direction or both directions at the same time. But it's still very early, and we'll have to see. It's variable precisely because we'll have to see issue by issue and I suppose region by region as we move forward.
Right. Well, on the region by region, I mean, all these different middle powers, they often face very different regional contexts. They have very different interests with each other. Sometimes they are even rivals with each other. In your short experience at the UN to date, have you had significant experience and success with dealing with other middle powers and bridging the gaps, even though Canada's often quite far away geographically from many of them?
Well, the UN in New York is a rather unique place simply because all the countries in the world are here, and I have 193 counterparts here, and for the most part, it's a tightly knit group, and we do see each other very often, whether it's in formal things like the General Assembly or ECOSOC, or in the Security Council, or whether it's less formal settings and other committees and receptions. There is a great deal of goodwill. I mean, I haven't been here long enough to say we've solved, problem X or problem Y, working with countries A, B, and C. But what I can say is that particularly after the Prime Minister's speech in Davos, there has been a lot of buzz generated, good buzz, in the sense that people are coming up to me as the ambassador of Canada and saying, "Loved your prime minister's speech. How can we make this work moving forward? Always willing to work with Canada moving forward." Those kinds of messages were abundant, both in bilateral settings, but also in front of other colleagues at larger group settings. Loved what Canada said. We love what the Prime Minister said. We're willing to work. And so there is a great deal of goodwill that has been generated. A great number of countries looking for leadership. These aren't easy times. These are complicated times. You have, if you look at what's happening in the world, you understand the complexity. And so countries are looking for a leader of the kind of that Prime Minister Carney is demonstrating to be. And that's important. And that's important for the whole project moving forward.
Excellent. Thanks so much. To help us understand variable geometry and its strategic implications a little further, I know it's early days, as you said, but is there a sense in your mind that Canada could even come to embrace elements of what we call in the global south multi-alignment? Countries like Brazil and India pursue not just non-alignment often, but even multi-alignment. Does Canada have something to learn from global south countries there in its ability in their ability to maintain relations with all sorts of different powers simultaneously, or do you anticipate rather that the variable geometry is likely to be, rather a relatively minor complement to a Canadian foreign policy that's just inevitably going to remain largely anchored in North America and the transatlantic alliances, as you were mentioning before, for the reasons you mentioned before?
Well, hard to speculate on what it might look like, but certainly, I would think that all options are on the table. So using the UN, continuing to use the UN where the UN is effective, or can be effective, continuing to improve the UN where the UN needs improvement. But also continuing to build or beginning to build other kinds of alignments, and multi-alignments are possible, recognizing not only our traditional groupings, and remember, we have other groupings already, right? Like the G7 and the G20, which the OECD, which aren't part of the UN structure and sit alongside it and are either more important or less important depending on the circumstances and the questions being discussed. Those kinds of things will continue. I certainly think there are a number of countries in the global south who are increasingly important, not only economically, but in terms of values. Think of Brazil, for example, which showed a great deal of democratic resiliency in its last elections, and continues to move forward with a democratically elected government, notwithstanding pressures against it. So there is. One could say, one could look at India and see the economic power that exists. Again, we're trying a reset there, and this is not to say we agree with every policy that the Indian government has, and the Indian government wouldn't agree with every policy that we have. But find ways to work with India within the context of the UN, within the context of enhancing trade, within other contexts as cases may arise.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And to our audience, please feel free to post some questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to a few of those in the second half of the webinar. But let me turn in the meantime to the theme of human rights, Ambassador. The Prime Minister's speech did touch on human rights as being one of the primary principles that Canada will continue to promote. But does the pursuit of variable geometry, in your view, mean toning down criticism of authoritarian regimes at the UN? Your immediate predecessor, Bob Rae, for example, was not shy about calling out China at the United Nations, and he even called for a UN investigation into the plight of the Uyghurs in China. But now Canada is using the language of strategic partnership to describe its relationship with Beijing, following and in the lead up to as well, Prime Minister Carney's recent trip to Beijing. So what is the standard we should expect going forward on this front from Canada as it relates to the intersection between the need to pursue pragmatism and variable geometry on the one hand and human rights norms on the other?
Well, I think the first thing to underline is the most important point, which is we remain firmly committed to advancing human rights around the world and protecting human rights both within Canada and in other places. That hasn't wavered. That hasn't changed. I think what we are admitting in this world, and the United Nations remains one of the primary institutions for that dialogue, the Human Rights Council, as well as the other institutions of the United Nations, remains the principal forum where a lot of these discussions will happen. That being said, I think what we have come to realize is that there are times when, for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, the advancement of human rights is best done in a lower key, and is best done with a private conversation as opposed to public criticism. That recognizes that there are different cultures, and there are different challenges, and protecting human beings and protecting human rights is a complex issue. And there are times when we will need to call people out, and there are times when we will need to use other levers that are less obvious, but hopefully more effective in ultimately protecting the human rights of people around the world.
We have a question from Liv Serba in our audience, and she asks, is Canada going to be a vocal defender of LGBT rights and especially women's rights at the UN? I think we saw a headline a few months ago that the Prime Minister plans to step back from his predecessor, Justin Trudeau's feminist foreign policy. Do you anticipate that that's going to manifest itself in any concrete fashion in terms of Canada's engagement at the UN?
We continue to prioritize in terms of what we do at the UN. We continue to prioritize the protection of women's rights, the protection of LGBTQ2+ rights, and that will continue. What we do not want is for the rhetoric to get in the way of the substance. So we are still substantively committed to advancing all of these, I would say, traditional Canadian values, or important Canadian values, but we won't let rhetoric get in the way of being effective at doing that. And again, understanding that this is a complex world, and in order to advance the rights of the human rights of individuals, we will need to have different kinds of strategies depending on the context. But the commitment hasn't wavered.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Let's now move on to the theme of multilateral reform in particular. This is an issue that we've thought a lot about at the Better Order Project, that we've published on, especially as it relates to UN Security Council reform. In defense of variable geometry, Mr. Carney's speech made reference to what he called naive multilateralism. And he questioned the utility of relying on multilateral institutions whose effectiveness has been diminished in recent years. Now, back when Canada was rhetorically defending the rules-based order, we could couch our support for the UN within our support for the rules-based international order. But do you think that the Prime Minister's speech signals in some way that the UN now occupies a less prominent place in Canada's foreign policy thinking, relatively speaking? It used to be really up there. But now we're talking about cooperation with different groups of countries, sometimes the vast majority of countries, as he said in his remarks. But he did, to some extent denigrate multilateralism. So I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in on that.
Well, I think in the fullness of the Prime Minister's speech, he did mention the UN Charter and the values there, and I think there is a critique of being naive within that. So it's naive multilateralism that is problematic. It's not multilateralism itself, in the sense that there are times when multilateral institutions and the UN as a multilateral institution work well. But there's also a recognition, and this is about not being naive, that in other cases it does not work well. And it either needs to be reformed, or we need to find, at least at a particular moment in time, we need to find another different path, a plurilateral path, a path with variable geometry that allows us to achieve the desired result, whether it's an economic result that we're looking at, whether it's a security result that we're looking at, or whether it's protecting human rights. So there is a role for multilateralism, but we have to be realistic about what it can accomplish in a given case in particular circumstances. When our traditional forms of multilateralism, like the UN or a UN institution, can't do the job, then we have to look elsewhere. Let me give you an example. And it's an example that both Canada and the United States are working on together. That's the gang suppression force in Haiti. Again, there is the UN Security Council, for all its imperfections, has delegated to a group of countries led by the United States and Canada, has delegated the task of suppressing gangs in Haiti. Canada has played a role, not just with financial support, but in developing the process as it moves forward. Ambassador Ray did this before I got here, and now I've continued in the work. We now have twice as many soldiers committed as we need. Those soldiers are being trained primarily in gang suppression. We are working on the other forms of support for that mission to succeed. And again, so this is something that the UN has delegated to a group of countries that I think realize that something else has to be done on the ground. It doesn't look like the traditional UN peacekeeping model. So it's a pragmatic response. It's a necessary response. We're trying to help the Haitian people, and the Haitian people are open because they're frankly living in terrible circumstances in certain parts of the country. And so we're moving forward with a different kind of multilateral idea that has certain countries involved and with different levels of intensity. These kinds of things, these kinds of solutions, I think, are going to be increasingly important as we move forward, and we will identify the kinds of potential solutions as we move forward, given the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Isaac Baylor, and he asks that in a world of fragmentation, where do we draw the line between pursuing transactionalism as a stabilizing force versus actually ensuring that we pursue a genuinely cooperative international environment? Is there some kind of long-term vision that's needed to ensure we get the latter rather than the former? Your thoughts?
I think given the complexity of the world, you have to keep both options on the table and assess which is better under the circumstances, better for Canadians and better for the world or the world order or human rights or whatever larger value we're taking into account. There will be times when a transactional approach will be necessary, particularly if it's a bilateral trade negotiation or there's some element of bilateral security that needs to be in some way enshrined. But there's always a virtue to larger degrees of cooperation, particularly if it leads to peace and stability over a wider swath of countries. You've got to keep both on the table. And I think what the Prime Minister said was, let's not be naive about this. We will, yes, use the UN where we can use the UN, but we will use other institutions and we will create and lead other configurations where it serves Canadians.
Is there a risk that pursuing transactionalism, that pursuing variable geometry, as the Prime Minister puts it, could that end up becoming a substitute almost by default for multilateral reform, and an insufficient substitute at that? And what I mean by that is, are ad hoc coalitions really going to be powerful enough to solve today's global problems without tackling some of the much deeper grievances about the unequal way in which key multilateral institutions continue to be structured even today?
Well, that's a complicated question, but the answer is also in the complexity. And so what I would say is that part of the decision to use a transactional approach, part of the decision to use a multilateral approach will be precisely the impact on multilateralism or transactionalism, as the case may be, right? So in choosing one, you're not choosing the other, and to some extent, it's that not choosing of the other that's also a factor. And so you have to weigh each particular situation as you move forward. It will depend, of course, a transactional decision that might have an impact, a deleterious impact on a multilateral institution, a trade institution, or the United Nations, or some other multilateral institution. Of course, you have to weigh that impact into account, and vice versa. So I think there's no definitive answer to the way you frame that question. Recognize the complexity in the situation, assess the situation, either in the best interests of your country or with other countries for a series of collective interests or values, and then pick the best moving forward, and course correct when you have to course correct. The whole point about being pragmatic is to keep your values in front of you and to move forward as best you can to defend your interests in a variety of different places and spaces, but to course correct where you need to course correct.
If I may, that sounds like a relatively easygoing and non-alarmist answer, whereas the Prime Minister did say in Davos that, we are living through a rupture and not a transition. Is there not a fear that these multilateral institutions are just going to cease to function if they don't tackle some of these major issues, going forward? Is simply forging these coalitions on a ad hoc basis, responding to events as they go along, is that enough, absent a longer term vision, to actually make sure that these institutions can actually be reformed?
No, and if I have conveyed that will be in any way easy, I correct that. I mean, this is not going to be easy. I'm trying to capture all the complexity and all the factors as we move forward. The ultimate answer to your larger question in this case is you still have to keep your values in front of you, and so we still believe in human rights. We still believe in the values that are expressed in the UN Charter. We still believe in the fundamental equality of countries. We still believe in the security of borders. All of that you have to keep all of that in the forefront as you move forward. And in many cases, that will push us towards continuing to use multilateral institutions and to develop and improve multilateral institutions. In some cases, it won't. And so I don't think, in keeping your values in front of you, that we are undermining the world order. We may depart from an institution like the UN to achieve certain purposes, but we'll still remain committed to building the best UN we possibly can. My predecessor, Bob Rae, was fond of saying that if we didn't have the UN, we'd have to recreate it. And I think that's right, as flawed an institution as it may be. And you've mentioned the Security Council, and the Security Council is one of the institutions that merits a great deal of criticism and calls for a great deal of reform. But it also remains one of the institutions that will be the hardest to reform. And so, in the meanwhile, we have to move forward with other aspects of the UN that work well, and we have to move forward with other kinds of configurations in order to achieve purposes of peace and security or other values that perhaps don't take the Security Council into account.
Let's talk about Security Council reform then. Given some of what I was saying before, that there may be a risk that the failure to produce a more representative council and a more effective council could end up fatally delegitimizing the UN system, and by extension, it could fracture the common multilateral order that, humanity still shares today, even, however imperfectly that multilateral order, may be. Given all of that, and given how high the stakes are, how urgent a priority is Security Council reform for Canada right now in comparison with other priorities that Canada currently has at the UN?
Well, let me dial back first to say that the Security Council was one of the fundamental compromises when this institution was created 80 years ago. And it was based on lessons learned with the League of Nations and really the lack of power. The best word is l'impuissance in French, the impotence of the League of Nations to prevent war, and particularly the Second World War, from happening. And so the trade-off was, in order to get the big players to buy into the UN, and after the Second World War, they were the United States, China, Russia, Great Britain, and France. in order to get the major powers to buy in, we would give them a veto, a permanent veto. And then as the UN evolved, as the Security Council evolved, and more seats were added to the table, etc., those permanent vetoes still remained. And it has been one source of frustration with the UN that a number of good initiatives, or perhaps necessary initiatives, or perhaps peacekeeping or peacemaking initiatives have been halted by a veto, or the inability to stop aggression has been halted by a veto. So it obviously remains a priority, but how do you fix an institution that was part of the original bargain? And how do you fix or amend an institution in a way that it's hard to take away something that a country already has? And in particular, you've got three of those powers, which are world powers, and it would be, it's hard. There are plans out there. It's hard to see a situation in which one of these countries either loses its veto or has that veto watered down in any way, shape, or form. So this is a complicated matter, and Canada's working. Other countries are working. I know your group has proposed ways to reform the manner in which a veto is exercised, or the manner in which the Security Council is composed, or both. All of those are on the table, and they remain important. There is currently, and Canada supports the current reforms that are being done to the UN, both to UN budgets. We've had a major budget cut that was negotiated at the end of 2025 that's being implemented now. We are working on mandate reform as a priority. It's something that can be done. There have been many mandates that have been created by the UN that are still in existence and still some way cost money and time and human resources, and yet they either aren't delivering, or there's no need for those results to be delivered anymore. So some method of reviewing those mandates moving forward and preventing mandates from going on forever. And third is the larger question of institutional reform, whether there are kinds of agencies that have overlap, and reducing overlap, and running the delivery, the service delivery part of the United Nations in a much more effective fashion. And there's the Security Council, and I would say the Security Council is the most difficult part, as with there have been resolutions and proposals to reform the Security Council for a long period of time. It's important to Canada. We're working diligently. We are part of a group that has taken a stance, and we're constantly reviewing stances and proposals that have come in from either other countries or other think tanks or agencies or experts. So let's be pragmatic about it. This will be the single hardest thing that we do. And I think what Prime Minister Carney was telling us about naive multilateralism was, we can't wait around for Security Council reform to do other things that we need to do, whether it's the protection or promotion of human rights, whether it's the protection or promotion of trade or economic interests in Canada, or promoting peace and security around the globe. We will, if the Security Council can act, we'll find other ways and other configurations to achieve the results that are best for Canadians and best for humanity.
Let me unpack a couple of the things that you mentioned in your answer. First, on the question of the veto, there is a perception among many UN member states, particularly small member states, that certain permanent members of the Security Council have abused their veto prerogatives and are no longer just using it to defend their core interests, which was the primary reason why the veto was set up, was primarily to prevent World War III. They're quite concerned at this point in time. For them, multilateralism is realpolitik, and they see the abuse of the veto as something that calls into question the legitimacy of the UN Security Council. Given that, and given the Prime Minister's, given the Prime Minister raising the possibility of forging some kind of a coalition of middle powers, could Canada forge such a coalition with other middle powers and certain small countries as well, behind certain concrete ideas to restrict the veto and the way that it's used, and then, use that collective bargaining power of that coalition against the P5. And given that the P5 aren't necessarily getting along all that well, we live in an era of great power competition. One or another of the great powers might want to, in fact, entertain some of those ideas in order to come off as having a better image vis-a-vis the vast majority of global states in order to win that competition against other powers. So what are your thoughts on that right now as a possibility? And of course, the window for such a possibility might be relatively small, given that President Trump is pursuing, a reset in relations with Russia. It looks like there's a kind of tentative détente with China so far as well, and this whole framing of great power competition that was very much embraced by the Biden administration has somewhat fallen by the wayside now under the Trump administration. So, perhaps, you were mentioning before that that Security Council reform is something we sort of can't wait for, and we have to pursue more urgent tasks. Perhaps there's an urgent window to pursue Security Council reform sooner rather than later. Might you agree?
Well, I'm certainly not going to. I'm not going to speak out of turn with respect to where the priorities of the Canadian government will eventually lie in the hypothesis that you just set out, right? So, if the opportunity presented itself, there would be obviously a discussion between the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Prime Minister, other experts, other Canadian experts within government and perhaps wider, to decide which way to move forward. So I'm not going to get myself out in advance of that discussion. What the Prime Minister has challenged us to do with his Davos speech is to think about these kinds of possibilities, and that's precisely what you've done in laying out this particular hypothesis in terms of how it might have an impact on Security Council reform. I would say, as an individual or as a scholar, that anything is possible, and that the hypothesis is interesting. But I'm not going to speak in any way for the Canadian government about whether that might become a priority or not. It's too early to tell. We'll see how it goes. There are UN reform processes, and we're still, again, I'm not going to say we're in the vapor trail of Davos still, and I'll wait for the government to articulate next steps, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to see where we're going next, and I'll leave it at that.
Got it. Thank you. You did mention the group that Canada is a part in when it comes to Security Council reform, which is Uniting for Consensus. Uniting for Consensus has stood out in particular for its opposition to increasing the number of permanent members on the Security Council quite consistently for several decades now. Even though the majority of countries at the United Nations do, in fact, want to expand the permanent membership of the Security Council. Now, if the persistent failure to reform multilateral institutions does indeed threaten the system of international norms and laws that we all rely on, what compromises might Canada be prepared to make for the greater good of making Security Council reform a reality as it relates to the composition of the Council, and particularly the permanent membership? And what compromises could Canada expect from G4 countries in return? For example, could Canada live with the idea of having new permanent members on the councils, but no vetoes for those permanent members, which is something that the Biden administration also embraced towards the end of its time in office?
Right. Look, again, I am not going to. I'm not going to speculate on where we might go with respect to actual proposals. The group to which we belong right now believes that adding permanent seats with adding more permanent seats or adding more permanent vetoes, given our previous experience over the last 80 years, is not helpful. That being said, there is an openness to discuss all the various kinds of proposals that are being put forward, to assess them and then see where we go. When that discussion happens, to some extent it is ongoing, but when that discussion comes to the forefront, Canada will be open to looking at proposals. I'm not going to say what we might trade off or what we won't. That's a discussion that the Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs will have, speaking to people on the ground like me and others, but also discussing within the confines of the cabinet room, where they would like Canada to go and what things they think Canada might be able to gain or trade off in order to make a certain result happen. So again, I'm not going to get out in front of that discussion other than to say the Prime Minister has exhorted us to think about these things pragmatically, and to assess these things pragmatically in a realistic way, both within the context of current multilateral institutions like the UN, but also to see other possibilities in terms of variable geometry.
That's all very fair. Although we were talking before about the good relations that Canada is trying to pursue now with countries like Brazil and India. And Brazil and India, of course, are two of the four countries in the G4. Probably the two most likely countries in the G4, in fact, to get a permanent seat, much more than Germany and Japan. Um, do you think that Canada risks unnecessarily aggravating relations with those countries by our membership in Uniting for Consensus? Is that not just an unnecessary irritant? What is the fundamental rationale by which we continue to cling to this group, Uniting for Consensus, especially if it does potentially pose a risk to our pursuit of variable geometry and resetting our relations with important rising powers like India?
Well, again, we're there for principled reasons. That past experience has shown that simply adding more permanent members won't ameliorate the efficacy of the Security Council. That being said, as I've just said, and you have underlined it, we are trying to expand trade relations through Mercosur, of which Brazil is probably the key member. In South America, we've had a reset with India. Both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs have visited. And so there's a new openness to building positive relationships with those countries. There's absolutely no question about that. Will that have an impact on our ultimate stand on the Security Council? I don't know. It's too early to speculate. But as I've said, we're there for principled reasons in that group. But that being said, we are open to hearing arguments and plans and potential solutions for making the Security Council a much more effective institution.
If I can push you one more time on something related to this, which is that India is the world's single largest country by population. It's going to be the world's third largest country in terms of the size of its economy by the end of this decade. It also is a nuclear power. Is it going to be sustainable for the United Nations? We're now more than 80 years after the UN was established. Is it going to be sustainable to have a situation in which Britain has a permanent seat on the Security Council, but India does not? Does that leave, if that status quo continues, is the UN fit for purpose in responding to the various security challenges and status-related demands in today's world? It already looks relatively untenable in 2026. Is it going to be in 2036 and 2046, et cetera? At some point, something's got to give, no?
Well, first of all, I would add a fourth bullet, which is India is probably the world's largest functioning democracy. They routinely have free and fair elections, and I think that's important to underscore in the context that you've just given. Of course, the world has changed in 80 years. Of course, the economic and power dynamics in the world have changed. Population dynamics in the world have changed since the UN was created. And of course, there's a recognition, I think, on the part of most countries, and perhaps even all countries, that the UN has to change and multilateral institutions have to change accordingly. And so it certainly is a factor that has to be looked at, that India is a rising economic and political power and nuclear power and democratic power. And hopefully any reform that takes place will take new realities, Brazil, India, into account. How that will look, I don't know. How that is compared to the UK having a veto, I don't know. Are these kinds of things the kinds of things that will be discussed? Yes, of course. And are they the kinds of things that are being discussed? Yes, of course. There are various propositions and various proposals out there supported by different countries in different places. And Canada will be part of those discussions. But again, it would be impossible for me to speculate on how the shape of it would look after a successful reform. But I can say that, of course, these are the kinds of things that need to be discussed in an institution that's 80 years old.
We have a question from the audience from Robin Collins, and it's a clarifying question on one of the responses that you had earlier about the rules-based international order. He says the rules-based international order is not the same thing as international law. How would the ambassador distinguish the two terms in terms of Canada's refreshed foreign policy now? Because pragmatism can be an argument, he says, for not strictly committing to international law. So there is certainly a criticism out there that, and the Prime Minister, of course, voiced this himself in Davos, that the rules-based international order to some extent is a deliberately opaque concept, and it allows you to claim that you are acting in defense of the order even when you are violating international laws. So in your mind, you're a legal scholar, how would you distinguish between the RBIO and international law?
Well, international law is the body, the body of rules and norms that exist as a result of either formal sources of law, such as the ruling of the ICJ, or an international treaty, whether it's bilateral or whether it's multilateral, or a convention that forms the basis for those treaties. So there's a source there. There's also customary international law, which is a little harder to determine, but can have a great deal of normative weight depending on the circumstances, and that evolves over time, and that's the manner in which states accept a norm by virtue of the way they practice or act or decisions that they take. Sometimes there will be the interoperation of both. For example, the law of the sea treaty. The United States has not adopted the law of the sea treaty, but accepts a number of the principles in there as customary international law, and therefore abides by them. And in many cases, you'll get a treaty that actually incorporates a great number of things from customary international law and puts it in writing. The international rules-based order is the manner in which countries come together to discuss a number of different issues through a number of different institutions, including the development of and the application of international law. And so the rules-based order is a different. It is, in a sense, part of the way in which the international law is applied, but also, in a sense, governs or attempts to govern, probably the better way to put it, the relationships between states, the manner in which we try, if the charter is the UN Charter is a matter of and the Covenant on rights is an expression of international law. The manner in which we try to protect those rights through institutions, whether it's at the UN or whether it's in front of the ICJ, that's part of the rules-based order. And so the two interoperate. And if I've given the impression the two are the same thing, I correct that. Both of these things will develop in different ways. Customary international law can develop on its own by virtue of the interactions between states, between and among states, and practices that become longstanding and therefore have normative weight at a certain point in time, to the point that it can be identified as such in let's say a legal proceeding in front of the ICJ, or to the extent that it convinces a country to do or not do something based on the weight of that norm. And the same thing is true for a treaty. A treaty may contain a mechanism for enforcement within the treaty, a tribunal process, or whatever. We have to chew gum and walk at the same time, in the sense that we need to be able to work through existing institutions to defend, initiate, ameliorate international norms, but also to defend the institutions, ameliorate the institutions, make them more efficient, that form part of the rules-based international order. That includes a multilateral space like the United Nations, but it includes other kinds of configurations and institutions as well.
Got it.
sorry for that long answer, but it is a complex. There is complexity here, and we need to embrace that complexity and do our best on a variety of different fronts at the same time. All the time. I'm going to repeat this every time, and I'm going to bore you to death. But keeping our values in front of us, so that we have a guiding light or a roadmap as we move forward, and perhaps on roads that we've never taken before.
Thank you, Ambassador. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to try to squeeze in two questions if we can. One's from the audience, from Joel Sokolsky. He says, President Trump has already criticized Prime Minister Carney for the Davos speech, threatening even higher tariffs, and now there's a threat even to renegotiate the new terms, rather, of the new bridge crossing between Windsor and Detroit, the Gordie Howe Bridge. Just for the record, for our audience, Canada did pay 100% of the cost of building that bridge. Government of Michigan is going to own 50% of it. And American steel and labor were used in the construction of the bridge, and President Trump did, approve this bridge and expedite its construction in his first term in office. All of that aside, he asks, how much short-term economic pressure can Canada take to achieve the long-term, and he says, vague objectives that the Prime Minister laid out in Davos?
I think it's fair to say the Prime Minister has answered, has engaged President Trump. So I'm not going to put words in the mouth of the Prime Minister or lay out a strategy for the Prime Minister. He has ministers and a team and negotiators to do that. Obviously, I will play a role if asked, but he has a new ambassador who will be starting in Washington, and he's got Minister LeBlanc and others to work out the detail of that. Canada's a strong country. Canada does its homework. Canada prepares for negotiations. Canada, I've seen it from the inside when I was in government. The last time we renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, we will be prepared this time. And Canada has not just a lot of resources. I don't mean this in the traditional sense of resources. I mean in the sense of negotiating leverage. We have a lot of pluses on our side of the ledger, and we're proud of those pluses. We're proud of the way in which we negotiate, and we're proud of the way in which we deal with other countries, and in particular the manner in which we deal with the United States. That's going to continue, and I'm pretty confident that this government has the talent and the capacity to negotiate the best possible deal for Canadians when it comes to renegotiating the trade agreements, and that it has the same capacity and talents to look out for Canadian interests elsewhere around the world, and to do so in an effective and fair manner as we move forward. I really do have a lot of confidence in this government as we move forward.
That answers my final question as well, so no need to get to it. And we're right at the hour pretty much, so I think it's a great opportunity to wrap up the discussion right there. Ambassador, merci beaucoup, grazie mille. This was a real pleasure to have you today. I hope we'll be able to host you again. Thank you again to all of our audience for joining us today at the Quincy Institute. To find out more about the Better Order Project, you can go online to betterorderproject.org. And of course, please do register as well for future webinars at the Quincy Institute website, which is quincyinst.org as well. Thank you so much. Arrivederci. Au revoir.
Thank you. Grazie. Merci.